I was in a webinar the other day with a very talented copywriter who I really admire and respect. And she was talking about injecting storytelling into our marketing. And it really got me thinking about some of the thoughts that I have had about this in the past, when it comes to personal branding, as well as thoughts that I know my clients have. And the biggest one is that when it comes to storytelling, I don't have anything dramatic to tell about my story. So will anyone really be interested? And this thought either leads people to not telling their stories or making something that isn't very dramatic for the sake of it, like injecting that drama into something that doesn't need it just for engagement. And neither of these routes are effective. So I wanted to help you a little bit in this episode to help you just encourage you start telling your story, because it is such a powerful way to connect with the right clients. Now, if you're new to this podcast, then huge welcome. I'm Sumantha, and I'm a qualified business trainer, and I used to work corporately before I became a secondary school teacher. I now use my business education experience. I use it all to help tutors and education business owners really design businesses that fit with their income goals, the impact they want to make, as well as their life goals, the kind of life they want to lead. And when I think about this, the most common issue that tutors have is that they are time poor, and yet there are so many things they're meant to be doing and that they need to do, especially in the realm of marketing. So this episode is actually going to make sure that when you are marketing, when you are spending your energy there, we're going to ensure it does some heavy lifting for you so that whatever time you do spend, it's absolutely worth it. So let's start with why storytelling is so powerful. And we will inject a little bit of what it means in the context of marketing as well. When I used to train corporately, when I used to deliver training on things like public speaking, storytelling was a core part of the course because, and I won't go into the science of it, but human beings are really wired to pay attention to stories. It's why we go through such a range of emotions and we get a dopamine hit when we are watching something. Let's say you're watching a film or something, or if you're reading a book. We are wired to pay attention to the words, "Let me tell you a story." And so when we think of the whole point of marketing, it isn't to make sales. It's actually designed to connect with the right customer. So it's effectively a bit of a gatekeeper, which then leads to a sale. A sale is a byproduct of really strong marketing. And that's very different from advertising. So when it comes to marketing, through things like storytelling isn't something we do artificially or dramatically. For you to feel like I hear you and I see you, I don't need to tell you anything all that dramatic about me. For instance, if you're at the stage where you've been tutoring for a while and you're at capacity and you're worried about how you can sustain this and you're feeling a bit unsafe about the future because if you don't work, you don't earn, I hear you because I have been exactly there. In fact, I sometimes still think about it because on the tuition side, I'm still an independent tutor, or at least I am at the time of recording this, because that could change any time. Now, that isn't massively dramatic. It's not this kind of rags to riches story, and it's not even all that emotional, but it does connect. It does resonate. So let's start there. I want you to think about who your ideal client is. Now, I'm not talking about their age and their socio-economic background and, the typical textbook things that you might think about when you're defining a client avatar or target audience. That's not what we want to talk about. I want you to really get into the bones of how your target client, your ideal client, that you haven't met yet, how do they feel right now before they've met you and they need you? How do they feel when they come across you? And actually, how do you want them to feel? And when they press that button to book a call with you or to make an inquiry, how do they feel in that very moment? And when you then get on a call with them or you reply to an inquiry, how do you want them to feel? You can see that there were various touch points there. And typically, the journey can oscillate between our client feeling in some form of crisis to us helping them feel relieved. So, if we want them to feel relieved, what do they need to experience through our content? What do we need to tell them to make sure that they know about us and so that they feel seen and heard? So, let me give you a practical example, a very typical one that some of the tutors I speak to are often in. You open Facebook and you can see that you have a notification on Messenger. A parent has asked you, how much do you charge? Maybe they've seen an advert, or maybe they've, seen you in a Facebook group. Now, they're not really giving much away with that question. So we don't know what piece of content maybe that came from. We don't even know how they might be feeling. They're just asking, how much do you charge? So in that situation, rather than just telling them how much we charge, we need to start getting a gauge on how they're feeling. So we could reply with some questions, some very intentionally designed questions. What those questions are will depend entirely on what you offer and, of course, who your client is, who that person is in front of you. But generally speaking, you want to essentially find out where they are now and where they want to be. Now, I'm not suggesting that you withhold your price if someone actually asks for it, but that doesn't mean you also have to have a transactional conversation. It can be relationships led. So I've given you an example where someone just asks a really direct question, but you can apply this concept regardless of how they've approached you and what they may have asked you. So let's imagine you've asked some of those questions, you have a gauge on how they're feeling, or you can make an accurate guess. Now you want to ask yourself, well, what story could you tell them that makes them feel safe and assured? This comes before we really tell them all about our offer, because regardless of how good or bad our offer is, or how cheap or how expensive it is, if someone doesn't feel safe, if they don't feel assured, if they don't feel connected, they're simply not going to go for it. And if we go back to that principle that we are wired to tune into stories, this is the perfect place for it. So, in the situation where you might tell a story of a student who is in a very similar situation to their child, and how, you were supporting them and what the outcome would be, that would really help them feel like you understand. And so that's a really simple example, but you can shape this to whichever situation where you're referring to, or whichever situation you're in. So let's take a broader example now. You want to put some storytelling into your marketing, and you want to do it in a way that doesn't feel artificial or like, you're trying too hard to fit this story in. The first thing is to be very intentional. And that's really the first principle of any form of marketing. So you need to know what you're trying to achieve. So are you trying to grow your email list, let's say? Are you trying to get people to book a call with you? Are you trying to head people to your YouTube channel? Are you trying to attract new connections? Are you trying to start a conversation with your audience? Decide on your intention first. What do you want? Because that's going to steer the kind of story that you're going to tell. But regardless of the outcome, that founding principle remains the same, which is that a story essentially needs to resonate with someone. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to agree with whatever it is you're trying to put across. But if you're trying to connect with people, they have to be able to at least relate to your story. So I might tell a story of how I experimented with removing homework from how I support my tutees, and how I found that that adversely affected their outcomes, their progress. We lost momentum. And I might go into the story of how I discovered that and what led me to that experiment, or even maybe a research paper that I read that may have influenced me to experiment with that. And then I could talk about how I discovered that actually for my student, it's something that they really need and that it really helps them. Now, a tutor reading that may disagree with me. They may adamantly believe that we shouldn't be setting homework. It's a waste of time. It's not needed. Some tutors might believe that we should be setting homework and that it's absolutely crucial. The point is that if my goal was to start a conversation, I have chosen to tell a story that really resonates with them and they understand it and they can relate to it. It's really easy for them to respond. I'm talking about something that maybe they've had similar thoughts about, or a debate that they're quite interested in getting involved in. And so they're ready to give their opinions. And so I'm just going to circle back to something that I said near the beginning of this episode, which is that when you hear about the power of storytelling, it doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be one of those rags to riches stories for people to feel inspired or to resonate with you. It doesn't have to be a story of how you triumphed over adversity for people to feel that inspiration or for people to want to simply work with you. You just have to make clear that when it comes to whoever your ideal client is, you get them. And that's why you have to understand them and how they feel at those different points. And that's what storytelling can achieve. It's really impactful. Now, I will differentiate here between storytelling and analogies. I remember ages ago running a webinar on how tutors can make the most of LinkedIn, how they might want to use it, and so on. And I asked my audience what kind of things they wanted me to cover in this webinar. And I remember a few people agreeing with someone who commented saying that they wanted to know how they could create content that where they didn't have to always share some kind of moral or inspirational message or lessons learnt, because they just found that a little bit cringe. Now, I'm not here to tell you what you should and shouldn't do, because I think that everyone should do what feels natural and what feels right for them. So if you like a good analogy, go for it. It doesn't matter what other people may think necessarily, because the right people, the people who are connected to you, the people who resonate with you, they'll feel connected to however you communicate. The only reason, and I'm bringing this up, is because I do think it's useful to separate storytelling as a content strategy to analogies. Analogies might be where you are drawing some kind of conclusion or lesson from an unrelated situation. So I might talk about, what looking for a holiday taught me about business, for instance. But a story doesn't necessarily have to have a hidden message or a moral message or a lessons learned. It can just be a really direct story related to the thing you want people to connect to, the thing you want them to feel, the conversation you may want to spark. I remember ages ago procrastinating on doing my accounts. That's very typical me. And every time I would sit down to do it, I would actually end up opening Canva and thinking, do you know what? I really should just, get ahead on some of my social media content, even though I didn't actually need to. I needed to do my accounts. And it was just because I basically wanted to avoid doing my accounts. It's not something I enjoy. And so I found going on Canva far more exciting, a bit more creative. And when I observed that about myself, I found it quite amusing and presumed there might be other people who do the same. And I wrote a post about it on LinkedIn. And so many people were saying how they felt seen and, how they could totally relate. And they gave their own examples and told me how they do something really similar. And it was just a really lovely point of connection with the people who I work with or who I could potentially work with, or people who I just know, who are in my audience. And, where they understand that I understand the nuances of being a business owner and the struggles that we have when we're doing it alone. It just gave that lovely point of connection. So the next time that you want to create something that your audience can really resonate with, tell a story. And if you're talking about, let's say, a student, a student who's struggling with a particular concept in your subject, or a particular thing like motivation, you could talk about how you remember your teacher giving you feedback about something similar. You could talk about, what you did in that situation or how you struggled with it. If you can dig out an old report card, for example, and show a picture of it, even better. Storytelling is there in marketing to connect with people. Sometimes it entertains in the process, but its primary purpose, the driver, is to connect, not necessarily to entertain. And when we overthink telling stories because we think that, they should be dramatic or entertaining, we're placing its purpose too heavily on entertaining. We are placing its purpose too heavily on trying to get loads of engagement. So if you want a place to start off the back of this episode, here's what I would suggest. Think about those feelings that I mentioned at those different touch points that your potential clients will experience, before they've met you, when they met you, and so on. If you can, base it on some existing clients because then it will be a lot more tangible. Try and recall the words they used if you don't have them recorded somewhere. And just create a little bank of short stories that you could tell that would resonate with someone. It could be something so simple. It could be, I remember when I was a teacher and I used to find that children found X, Y, and Z. This exercises that muscle. It gets you thinking. And after a while, you will find these stories come very naturally. And you'll end up just observing those little moments in your everyday life that other people will resonate with. And you'll just bank them, you'll just store them. So that's all from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And you will hear from me on Wednesday. If you're hesitant about injecting stories, just remember that you don't have to reveal your deepest, darkest secrets. They don't have to be dramatic. They don't even have to be entertaining. They just need to connect.